The first book of Samuel, chapters 1 through 6. Chapter 1. There was a certain man of Ramathaim Zophim in Mount Ephraim, whose name was Elkanah ben Jarkam, ben Eliahah, ben Tocho, ben Suph, the Ephrathite. And he had 2 wives. The name of the first was Hannah, and the name of the second Peninnah. And Peninnah had children, but Hannah had none. This man went up yearly from his village to worship and to sacrifice to the Lord of hosts in Shiloh, where 2 sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were priests to the ever-living. When it was Elkanah's day for sacrifice, he gave to Peninnah his wife and to all her sons and daughters portions. But to Hannah he only gave a single portion, although he loved Hannah, for the ever-living had closed her womb. So she was vexed, anguished, and labored with rage, because the ever-living shut up her womb. He did this year after year, when he went up to the house of the ever-living, so she was vexed and would not eat. Elkanah therefore said to her, Wife Hannah, why do you weep? Why do you not eat? Why is your heart bad? Am I not better to you than 10 sons? Hannah, however, arose after eating and drinking in Shiloh, and Eli the priest sat upon the chair at the door of the temple of the ever-living, for her soul was bitter, and she prayed to the ever-living, and weeping she wept. She also vowed a vow, and said, Lord of hosts, if you will look on the anguish of your handmaid, and remember me, and not forget your handmaid, but grant to your handmaid a male child, I will give him to the ever-living all the days of his life, and a razor shall not go over his head. But while she continued to pray before the ever-living, Eli watched her mouth. Hannah, however, spoke from her heart, only moving her lips, and no sound was heard. Consequently Eli thought she was drunk. Eli therefore said to her, Why have you made yourself drunk? Cast the wine from you. But Hannah answered him, No, my lord, I am only a woman of depressed spirit. I have not drunk wine nor strong drink, but I am pouring out my soul before the ever-living. Do not consider your handmaid as a daughter of Belial, because I speak so much, for I have uttered my many griefs and sorrows so far. Then Eli replied and said, Go in peace, and may the God of Israel give you the request you ask from him. And she answered, May your servant find favor in your sight. The woman then went away and ate, and afterwards her face was not the same. In the morning they got up and worshipped before the ever-living, and then returned to their home at Ramah, where Elkanah knew Hannah his wife, and the ever-living remembered her. And at the end of the year Hannah conceived and bore a son, and called his name Samuel, because I have asked him from the ever-living. When the man Elkanah and all his family went up to sacrifice to the ever-living at the yearly sacrifice, and for his vows, Hannah went not up with him. For, she said to her husband, Not until I wean the boy, and take him up to the ever-living, then he shall always stay there. So Elkanah replied to his wife, Do as seems good to you. Stay until you wean him, and may the ever-living confirm his promise to you. Consequently the woman remained and nursed her son until she had weaned him. Then she went up with him, when he was weaned, taking 3 bowls and an ephah of flour and a skin of wine, and arrived at the house of the ever-living in Shiloh with the lad, and killed the bull, and brought the lad to Eli, and said, My lord, let your soul live. I, sir, am the woman who stood here at the door to pray to the ever-living. I prayed for this lad, and the ever-living granted to me the request I asked. So now, as I asked him from the ever-living, I myself dedicate him to the ever-living all the days of his life, and he shall worship the ever-living here. Chapter 2. Then Hannah gave thanks, and said, My heart rejoices in the Lord. By the Lord my horn is exalted, my face triumphs over my foes. For I rejoice in your salvation. None is sacred like you, Lord, for there is none beside you, nor fortress like our God. Increase not your proud speech. Pride comes badly from your mouth, for the Lord is a God of knowledge, though trifles are not weighed. The bows of strength are broken, and the feeble girt with might. The pampered beg for food, but the hungry now have rest. The childless has borne 7, and the many-sonned has want. The Lord kills and he revives, brings to the grave and raises. The Lord makes poor and rich, bows down and again exalts. He lifts the depressed from dust, exalts the poor from dunghills to sit along with princes, to inherit the throne of power. For the earth's supports are the Lord's, and upon them he rests the world. He guards the feet of his saints, but the wicked destroys in gloom. For man is not strong by wealth, but they fail who strive with him. When the Lord thunders from heaven, he rules to the bounds of the earth, and gives his chosen leader power, and exalts his anointed's horn. Elkanah afterwards returned to his home at Ramah, but the lad served the ever-living with Eli the priest. The sons of Eli, however, were profligates. They did not recognize the ever-living, although the priests governed the people. Whenever a person offered a sacrifice, a lad came from the priest when the flesh was boiling, with a 3-pronged fork in his hand, and stuck it into the cauldron, or boiler, or kettle, or pot. All that came up on the fork the priest took for himself. They did the same to every Israelite who came to Shiloh. Also, before the time that they burnt the fat, the priest's lad came and said to the man sacrificing, "Give the priest meat from the ribs, for he will not accept boiled meat from you. It must be raw." If the person replied to him, "Let the fat be burnt first, then take what you desire," he would answer him, "Give it at once, and if not, I shall take it by force." The young men were also very great sinners against the ever-living, for they corrupted the women who brought offerings to the ever-living. But Samuel served before the ever-living as an assistant, girded with an ephod. His mother also made him an embroidered robe, and brought it up to him every year when she went with her husband to sacrifice the yearly sacrifice. Then Eli blessed Elkanah and his wife, and said, "The ever-living granted you an heir from this woman in answer to her request from the ever-living." Then they returned to their village, and now the ever-living favored Hannah, and she conceived and bore 3 sons and 2 daughters. But the lad Samuel grew up with the ever-living. When Eli became very old, he heard of all the doings of his sons to all Israel, and how they corrupted the women who came to worship at the door of the hall of assembly. So he said to them, "What are these things that you do, which I have heard of, the vile practices towards all these people? Refrain, my sons, for it is not a good report that I hear of your practices against the ever-living. If a man sins against a man, they intercede with God. But if a man sins against the ever-living, who can intercede for him?" But they would not listen to the voice of their father, for the ever-living had decided to kill them. But the young man Samuel advanced and became great and good, both with the ever-living and also with men. A man of God therefore was sent to Eli, and said to him, "Thus says the ever-living, I revealed myself to the house of your fathers when you were among the Mizraim, and I chose it from all the tribes of Israel to myself as a priesthood to offer incense upon my altar, and to wear an ephod before me, and I gave to the house of your fathers all the gifts of the children of Israel. Then why do you despise my sacrifices and offerings which I commanded for frailty, and respect your sons more than me, by letting them fatten themselves with the best of all the offerings of my people Israel? Therefore the ever-living God of Israel says, I promised that your house and the house of your fathers should walk before me forever. But now the ever-living has said to me tonight, Whoever honors me I will honor, and whoever degrades me shall be degraded. Now the time has come when I will break your necks and the heirs of the house of your fathers from being noble in your house, and you may expect suffering instead of pleasantness from all that gives Israel pleasure. For there shall not be a noble in your house for all time. However, I will not cut off every one of your descendants forever at my altar, to exhaust your eyes and make your soul languish, yet great men shall die from your house. And this shall be the proof. Your 2 sons, Kophni and Phinehas, shall both of them die in one day. Then I will appoint for myself a faithful priest who will do according to my own heart and soul, and I will build him a perfect house, and cause him to walk before my Messiah for all time. And then all the remnant of your house shall come and bow to him for a penny of money and for a piece of bread, and say, I beg you to admit me to a priest's office, that I may eat a mouthful of food. Chapter 3. Meanwhile the young man Samuel served the ever-living before Eli. But a word from the ever-living came seldom in those days. There was no frequent vision at that time. And when Eli was in bed in his residence, and his eyes were becoming heavy, he was not able to see, and the lamp of God was becoming dim, and Samuel was in bed in the temple of the ever-living, where the ark of God was, then the ever-living called to Samuel, and he replied, I am here, and ran to Eli and said, I am here, for you called me. But he answered, I did not call you. Return to bed. So he went and laid down. Then the ever-living called again, Samuel! And Samuel arose and went to Eli and said, I am here, for you called me. But he replied, I did not call, my son. Return to bed. Samuel, however, was beginning to recognize the ever-living, and the word of the ever-living was beginning to be revealed to him. So the ever-living again called, Samuel! Samuel! For the third time, and he arose and went to Eli and said, I am here, for you did call me. Then Eli perceived that the ever-living had called to the young man. Therefore Eli said to Samuel, Go, lie down, and if he calls to you, then say, Speak, Jehovah, for your servant listens. So he lay down in his chamber. Then the ever-living confirmed it, and called as before, Samuel! Samuel! At which Samuel replied, Speak, Jehovah, for your servant listens. Then the ever-living said to Samuel, I will now do a thing in Israel at which both the ears of all hearing it shall tingle. On that day I will heap upon Eli all that I have said concerning his house, the strong and the weak. For I will display myself to him, as I myself will punish his family forever, on account of the outrages of his sons, whom he did not restrain. And therefore I have sworn to the house of Eli, that the sin of the house of Eli shall not be expiated by sacrifice or gift forever. But Samuel lay still until dawn, when he opened the doors of the house of the ever-living, for Samuel feared to report the vision to Eli. But Eli called Samuel, and said, Samuel, my son? And he replied, I am here. Then he asked, What was the thing that was told to you? Hide it not from me. Tell me every word which was told to yourself. Samuel consequently reported to him the whole communication, and hid nothing from him. To which he replied, It was the ever-living. Let him do what is good in his sight. Thus Samuel became great, and the ever-living was with him, and none of his words fell to the ground. And all Israel recognized from Dan to Beersheba that Samuel was a true teacher from the ever-living. The ever-living also continued to appear in Shiloh, for the Life revealed himself to Samuel in Shiloh by the word of the ever-living. Chapter 4. And the word of Samuel penetrated all Israel. Afterwards Israel went to meet the Philistines in war, and encamped at Ebenezer, and the Philistines encamped in Aphek. Then the Philistines disposed themselves to meet Israel, and opened out to the battle, and Israel was routed before the Philistines, and they slew in the open field about 4,000 men. So when the army returned to the camp, the judges of Israel asked, Why has the ever-living routed us before the Philistines today? Let us take the ark of the ever-living with us from Shiloh, and go to oppose them, and it will save us from the clutch of our enemies. The army therefore sent to Shiloh, and brought the ark of the covenant of the Lord of hosts, who rests between cherubim, from there. But the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, went with the ark of the covenant of God. And when the ark of the covenant of the ever-living came to the camp, and the children of Israel saw it, they shouted aloud so that the earth shook. And the Philistines heard the sound of the shouting, and asked, What is the noise of this great shouting in the camp of the Hebrews? And they were informed that the ark of the ever-living had come to the camp. Then the Philistines were afraid, for they said, God has come to their camp, and exclaimed, Woe to us! Who can deliver us from the hand of this splendid God of theirs, the God who defeated the Mizrahites with such a total defeat in the desert? Let us harden ourselves and be men, Philistines, for fear they should enslave you as you enslaved them. So be men and warriors. The Philistines consequently fought and routed the Israelites, and each man fled to his home, for the defeat was very great. There fell also 30,000 regular troops of Israel, and the ark of God was captured, and the 2 sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were killed. But a man of Benjamin fled from the battle, and came to Shiloh on the same day, with his clothes torn and earth on his head. And when he arrived, Eli was sitting on his chair beside the road to Mizpah, for his heart was troubled about the ark of God. And the man came to report to the town, and he called to all the village. When Eli heard the sound of wailing, he asked, What means this noise in the crowd? So the man hastened and came and told it to Eli. Now Eli was 98 years old, and his eyes were fixed so that he was not able to see. So the man said, I have come from the battlefield. I have fled from the battlefield today. Then he asked, What was the result, my son? When the reporter answered and said, Israel has fled before the Philistines, and there is a great panic on the army, and your 2 sons are killed, Hophni and Phinehas, and the ark of God has been captured. But when the ark of God was mentioned, he fell off the chair backwards towards the side of the gate, and broke his neck, for he was an old man and heavy. He had ruled in Israel 40 years. The wife of Phinehas was near being delivered of a child when she heard the report of the capture of the ark of God, and of the death of her father-in-law and husband, and she fell down and brought forth, for her grief overwhelmed her. But at the moment of her death, the attendants who stood by her said, Never mind, for you have borne a son. She answered not, for her heart moved not. They consequently called the lad Ichabod, meaning that the glory has gone from Israel by the capture of the ark of God, and the death of her father-in-law and her husband. Therefore they wailed, Gone is the glory of Israel, for the ark of God has been captured. Chapter 5. When the Philistines had captured the ark of God, they brought it from Ebenezer to Ashdod, and then the Philistines took it to the temple of Dagon, and set it beside Dagon. But when the Ashdodites arose on the morrow, they saw Dagon had fallen on his face to the earth before the ark, and the head of Dagon, and the 2 palms of his hands cut off at the wrists, were on the threshold. Only a stump of Dagon was left to himself. Consequently the priest of Dagon, and all who enter the temple of Dagon, step over the threshold of Dagon in Ashdod to this day. Then the hand of the ever-living was heavy upon the Ashdodites, and he desolated them, and afflicted them with tumors in their extremities. The people of Ashdod consequently were terrified, and said, The ark of the God of Israel shall not remain with us, for his hand is hard upon us, and upon Dagon our God. They therefore sent and assembled all the lords of the Philistines, and asked, What shall we do with the ark of the God of Israel? They said, Gath shall hold the ark of the God of Israel, and have the custody of the ark of the God of Israel. But after they received it, the hand of the ever-living brought very great confusion, and afflicted the inhabitants of that city, from the least to the greatest, and they broke out in tumors. Then they sent the ark of God to Akron. But when the ark of God arrived at Akron, the Akronites cried out, exclaiming, Why do you send the ark of the God of Israel to us, to kill us and our people? So they sent and assembled all the lords of the Philistines, and said, Send away the ark of the God of Israel, and return it to its place, and do not kill us and our people. For there has been deadly suffering in all the city. The hand of that God has been very heavy here. Even the people who are not killed are afflicted with tumors, and the shrieks of the city have ascended to the heavens. Chapter 6. The ark of the ever-living was in the country of the Philistines 7 months. Then the Philistines summoned their priests and diviners to inquire, "What must we do with the ark of the ever-living? Inform us how we must send it back to its place." And they replied, "If you send back the ark of the God of Israel, you should not send it back empty, but you must return to him an offering, so that he may cure you, and inform you why he did not turn his hand from you." Then they asked, "What is the offering that we must return to him?" And they replied, 5 tumors of gold, the same as the number of the lords of the Philistines, and 5 mice of gold, for the same plague was upon you and your lords. Make also representations of the tumors, and of the mice that have ravaged the country, and pay honor to the God of Israel. Perhaps then he will lift his hand from upon you, and from your gods, and from your country. For why should you stupefy your hearts, as the Mitzrites and Pharaoh stupefied their hearts, so that they would not allow them to go up from them? Yet, when he had afflicted them, they sent them away, and they went. So now set to work and prepare a new cart, and select 2 heifers, who are suckling calves, who have not had yokes upon them, and harness the heifers to the cart, but put their young back to the stable. Then take the ark of the ever-living, and put it upon the cart, with the things of gold which you send to him as an offering. Put them in a box beside it, and send it away, and let it go. But watch, if it goes up the road to Beth-Shemesh, then he has sent these great sufferings to us. But if not, then we shall know that his hand has not struck us. It will have been an accident." Those men consequently did so, and took 2 nursing heifers, and harnessed them to the cart, but kept their young in the stable. They also placed the ark of the ever-living upon the cart, with the chest, and the mice of gold, and the representations of their tumors, and the heifers went straight in a track for the road to Beth-Shemesh, by the highway from the first. Going along they bellowed, but did not turn to the right or the left. And the lords of the Philistines followed after them to the borders of Beth-Shemesh. Now the harvesters of Beth-Shemesh were reaping wheat on the plain, and they looked up and saw the ark, and were glad of the sight. Then the cart came to the farm of Joshua the Beth-Shemeshite, and stood there, where there was a great stone. So they broke up the wood of the cart, and offered the heifers as a burnt offering to the ever-living. The Levites, however, took down the ark of the ever-living, and the chest which was with it, in which were the things of gold, and placed it upon the great stone, and the people of Beth-Shemesh burnt offerings, and sacrificed sacrifices on that day to the ever-living, whilst the 5 lords of the Philistines looked on, and then returned to Akron. These were the tumors of gold which the Philistines returned as an offering to the ever-living. For Ashdod, 1. For Gaza, 1. For Askelon, 1. For Gath, 1. For Akron, 1. With mice of gold equal to the number of all the cities of the Philistine, for the 5 lordships, for fortresses and open villages. And the great stone upon which the ark of the ever-living rested can be seen on the farm of Joshua the Beth-Shemeshite to this day. But the ever-living punished some of the inhabitants of Beth-Shemesh, because they had looked into the ark. He punished 70 persons and 50 bullocks. So the men murmured among the people, for the ever-living struck the people with a great stroke. The inhabitants of Beth-Shemesh consequently asked, "Who is able to stand before the holy Lord God, and to what purpose has he come up to us?" They therefore sent messengers to the people of Kirith-Jearim to say, "The Philistines have sent us the ark of the ever-living. Come down and take it to yourselves." The people of Kirith-Jearim consequently came, and took the ark of the ever-living, and brought it to the house of Abinadab on the hill, and he devoted his son Eleazar to take care of the ark of the ever-living. The ark of the ever-living, however, remained in Kirith-Jearim for a long period, 20 years altogether, and the whole house of Israel mourned after the ever-living. The end of chapters 1 through 6 of the first book of Samuel. Recording by Mark Penfold. The first book of Samuel, chapters 7 through 12. Chapter 7. The people of Kirith-Jearim consequently came, and took the ark of the ever-living, and brought it to the house of Abinadab on the hill, and he devoted his son Eleazar to take care of the ark of the ever-living. The ark of the ever-living, however, remained in Kirith-Jearim for a long period, 20 years altogether, and the whole house of Israel mourned after the ever-living. Then Samuel spoke to all the house of Israel, saying, If you turn to the ever-living with your whole heart, fling out the foreign gods from among you, and fling your heart to the ever-living, and serve him alone, and he will redeem you from the hands of the Philistine." The children of Israel consequently expelled the Baalim and the Ashtaroths, and served the ever-living alone. Then Samuel said, "Collect the representatives of Israel to Mitzvah, and pray for yourselves to the ever-living." They therefore assembled at Mitzvah, and drew water, and poured it out before the ever-living, and fasted on the same day, and said, "We have sinned against the ever-living." After that Samuel judged the Israelites in Mitzvah. But the Philistine heard that the Israelites had assembled in Mitzvah, so the lords of the Philistine went up to the children of Israel, and when the Israelites perceived it, they were in terror before the Philistine. The children of Israel consequently said to Samuel, "Work for us with a cry to the ever-living our God, that he may save us from the hand of the Philistine." Samuel therefore took a fat young lamb, and offered it as a whole burnt offering to the ever-living. Samuel also cried to the ever-living on account of Israel, and the ever-living answered. For while Samuel was offering the burnt offering, and while the Philistine advanced to battle with Israel, the ever-living thundered with a loud roar on that day over the Philistine, and defeated them, and routed them before Israel. Then the leaders of Israel advanced from Mitzvah in pursuit of the Philistine, and defeated them at Mithakaph, and at Bethkar. Therefore Israel took a stone pillar, and fixed it between Mitzvah and Hashen, and named it Aben-Azer, saying, "So far the ever-living has relieved us." Thus the Philistine were beaten, and did not repeat their advance to the borders of Israel, for the hand of the ever-living was against the Philistine during the period of Samuel. And he recovered to Israel the towns that the Philistine had taken from Israel, except Akron and Gath. He also delivered the borders of Israel from the power of the Philistine, and made peace between Israel and the Amorites. Samuel consequently judged in Israel during the whole time of his life. And he traveled continually, year by year, in circuit, through Beth-el, and Gilgal, and Mitzvah, and administered justice in all those districts, then returned to Ramoth, for his home was there. And there he administered justice to Israel, and there he built an altar to the ever-living. Chapter 8. But when Samuel grew old, he appointed his sons as judges in Israel. And the name of his eldest son was Joel, and the name of the second Abiah. They were judges in Beersheba. His sons, however, did not follow his ways, but extorted taxes, and took bribes, and perverted justice. Consequently all the judges of Israel assembled, and came to Ramoth, and said to him, "You are old now, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Therefore appoint a leader to organize us like all the nations." But the proposal was displeasing in the eyes of Samuel, because they said, "Give us a leader to organize us." So Samuel prayed to the ever-living, and the ever-living replied to Samuel, "Listen to the voice of the people, as to all they ask from you. For they have not rejected you, but have rejected me, their leader. It is like all the doings they have done from the day I brought them up from Mitzrayim to this day. For they rejected me, and served other gods, so they do also to you. Listen therefore now to their voice. You shall also confer solemnly with them, and explain to them the constitution for the leader who is to govern over them." Samuel consequently reported all the commands of the ever-living to the people, who demanded a leader from him, and said, "This will be the constitution by which he will rule over you. He will take your sons for his chariots and horsemen, and to run before his carriage. He will appoint colonels of regiments for himself, and captains of companies, also as mechanics in his workshops, as reapers of his harvest, and to make weapons for his soldiers, and appliances for his chariots. He will also take your daughters for confectioners, and cooks, and bakers, and he will take the best of your farms, and vineyards, and oliveyards, and give them to his ministers. And he will tithe your corn and wine, and give it to his officers and ministers. And your menservants and maids, and your best cattle and asses he will take and use them for his messengers. He will take your sheep, and make you his servants. And then you will shriek at the sight of your leader whom you have chosen for yourselves, but the ever-living will not answer you at that day." The people, however, refused to listen to the voice of Samuel, and replied, "No, he will only be a leader over us, and we shall then be like the other nations, and our leader can organize us and can lead us out and fight our battles." So Samuel listened to all the utterances of the people and reported them in the ears of the Ever-living. And the Ever-living replied, "Listen to their voice and select a leader for them." Samuel, however, said to the judges of Israel, "Go each to his own village." Chapter 9. Now there was a man of the tribe of Benjamin named Kish, ben Abial, ben Zeror, ben Bechorath, ben Aphrak, ben Ari, a Benjaminite of great power, who had a son named Saul, big and handsome, and there was not a man in the nation of Israel handsomer than he was, taller than any man by the shoulders and upwards. And Kish, Saul's father, had lost some asses, so Kish said to Saul his son, "Take with you one of the servants, and arise, go and seek those asses." He therefore went over Mount Ephraim, and searched in the country of Shilshah, and did not find them. Then he examined the district of Shalim, and they were not there. So he passed to the district of Jamin, and found them not. Thence they went to the country of Suph. When Saul said to his attendant, "Where will this journey take us to? Let us return, or my father will leave grieving for the asses, and fret about us." But he replied to him, "There is a man of God in this town, and a man to be respected. All he says happens. Let us go to him now. Perhaps he may tell us the way we should follow." Saul, however, answered to his lad, "Well, if we should go, how could we make the man to instruct? For our stock of bread is exhausted. So we have no present to bring to the man of God. What have we?" The youth continued in answer to Saul, "Look, I have found in my pocket a quarter shekel of silver. We will give that to the man of God, and he will inform us about our journey." Formerly in Israel a man said, when going to inquire of God, "Let us go to the seer," for the instructor of today was formerly called a seer. Then Saul replied to the youth, "You have spoken well. Let us go." They went accordingly to the top of the town, and met girls coming out to draw water, and asked them, "Is there a seer in this place?" And they answered them and said, "He is now before you on the hill, for he has today come to the town, for he sacrifices for the people on the height. So if you go into the village, you will meet him before he goes to the height to eat. The people will not eat before he comes, for he will bless the sacrifice. After that they will eat the festival. So now go, for this is the day to meet him." They therefore went up the village until they came to the center of the town, and then Samuel came to meet them at the ascent of the height, for the Ever-living had opened the understanding of Samuel that very day before the coming of Saul, saying, "At this time tomorrow I shall send to you from the district of Benjamin the man whom you must consecrate as the leader of my people Israel. He will deliver my people from the power of the Philistine, and he shall shepherd my people, for its cries have come to me." When Samuel saw Saul, the Ever-living said to him, "That is the man of whom I spoke to you. He will organize my people." Then Saul approached Samuel in the midst of the square, and said, "Can you inform me the way to the house of the seer?" And Samuel answered Saul and said, "I am the seer. Go before me to the height, and dine with me today, and I will send you off in the morning. I will inform you about all that is upon your mind. And as for your lost asses which you have hunted for 3 days, rest your mind about them, for they have been found. But now upon whom is the thought of all Israel? Is it not on you and on all your father's house?" Saul, however, answered and said, "Am I not a Benjaminite, of the smallest tribe in Israel, and of a clan less distinguished than any of the clans of the tribes of Benjamin? So why do you speak to me of such an honor?" Samuel then took Saul and his attendant and brought them to the dining room, and put them at the head of the guests, of whom there were about 30. Then Samuel said to the attendant, "Serve up the dish which I entrusted to you, the one I told you to reserve by you." So the attendant took the leg and lifted up and placed it before Saul. Then he said, "This is the portion that was to be placed before you. Eat, for it has been specially reserved for you, and I told the people I had invited." So Saul dined with Samuel that day, and when they descended from the height of the village, he talked with Saul on the veranda. Then they returned to sleep. But when the darkness had gone, Samuel invited Saul to go up to the top of the veranda, saying, "Rise up, and I will take leave of you." So Saul arose, and both went out, he and Samuel, into the street. When they had descended to the outskirts of the village, Samuel said to Saul, "Order the lad to go on before us." So he went forward. "But you stand a while, and listen to the command of God." Chapter 10. Then Samuel took a flask of oil, and poured it on his head, and kissed him, and said, "Is it not you whom the ever-living has consecrated over his inheritance, to lead it? When you go today from accompanying me, 2 men will meet you at the tomb of Rachel on the borders of Benjamin, at Zelzach, and will say to you, 'The asses which you went to seek are found, and your father has now left off the matter of the asses, and troubles about you, and says, What shall I do for my son?' And when you have gone from there a little way, and come to Alor Tabor, 3 men coming up to God at Bethel will meet you, one carrying 3 kids, and another carrying 3 baskets of bread, and another carrying a skin of wine, who will wish you health, and give you 2 cakes, which you must accept from them. After that you must go to the hill of God, where there is a garrison of the Philistine, and when you come near the village, you will encounter a band of reciters, descending from the height, and in front of them a piper, a drummer, and a flute and harper, and they will be reciting. Then the Spirit of the ever-living will seize you, and you will recite with them, and dance in unison. And when these sights come to you, go and use what you have found for yourself, for God is with you. Afterwards precede me to Gilgal, and then I will come down to you, to offer a burnt offering and sacrifice a sacrifice of thanksgiving. Wait for 7 days until I come, and inform you what you are to do." When he had turned his back from walking with Samuel, God entirely changed his heart when all these proofs came to him on that day. For when he came to the hill, a band of reciters met him, and the divine Spirit seized upon him, and he recited with them. When all who had known him formerly saw them, and how he was reciting with the reciters, all the people who were his neighbors exclaimed, "What has come to the son of Kish? Is Saul also among the reciters?" But a man from them answered and said, "And who is their father?" Consequently it became a proverb, "Is Saul also among the prophets?" When he ceased reciting, he went to the height. When Saul's uncle asked him and his attendant, "Where have you been?" And he replied, "To seek the asses. When I found them not, I went to Samuel." Then the uncle of Saul asked, "Tell me, what did Samuel say to you?" And Saul replied to his uncle, "He informed us that the asses were found." But he did not tell him a word about the leadership of which Samuel had spoken. Samuel afterwards convoked the people to the ever-living at Mitzvah, and said to the children of Israel, "Thus says the ever-living God of Israel, I brought Israel up from Mitzrayim, and delivered them from the hand of the Mitzrites, and from the hand of all the kingdoms that assailed them. But you now reject the God who recovered you from all your sufferings and distresses, and ask for a leader to place over you. So now present your tribes and regiments before the ever-living." Then Samuel advanced all the tribes of Israel, and the tribe of Benjamin was selected. Then he advanced the tribe of Benjamin by clans, and the clan of Matri was selected. Then Saul the son of Kish was selected, so they sought him, but could not find him. Consequently he inquired again of the ever-living whether that man had come. And the ever-living answered, "He is here, but has hidden himself among the baggage." So they ran and took him from there, and placed him in the center of the people, and he was taller than any one from the shoulders and upwards. Then Samuel said to the people, "You see whom the ever-living has chosen for himself, that there is not his equal in all the nation." And all the people cheered and exclaimed, "Long live the leader!" Samuel then related to the people the constitution of the leadership which he had written in a book, and then confirmed it before the ever-living, and then he dismissed all the assembly to their homes. And Saul also went to his home in Gibeah, and a force, whose hearts God had touched, went with him. But some sons of Belial said, "How can this fellow save us?" and abused him, and brought him no presents. But he kept silent. Chapter 11. When Nachash the Ammonite came up and besieged Jabesh-Gilead, all the chiefs of Jabesh said to Nachash the Ammonite, "Make a treaty with us, and we will serve you." But Nachash the Ammonite replied, "This is what I will do to you. I will put out all your right eyes, and make it a reproach to all Israel." Then the magistrates of Jabesh said to him, "Grant us 7 days, that we may send messengers to all the borders of Israel. Then, if there is no deliverance for us, we will come out to you." The messengers consequently went to Gibeah to Saul, and reported the matter in the hearing of the people, when all the people lifted up their voice and wept. But just then Saul came in after his oxen from the farm, and Saul asked, "What is the matter with the people, that they are weeping?" So they repeated the words of the chiefs of Jabesh. Then the Spirit of God seized Saul upon hearing it, and he was very furious, and took the pair of oxen, and cut them up, and sent to all the districts of Israel by the hands of the messengers, to say, "Whoever will not come after Saul and join Samuel, this shall be done to his oxen." The terror of the ever-living consequently fell upon all the people, and they came like one man. Then he organized them in Bazek, and there were 300,000 men of the children of Israel, and the men of Judah 30,000. And they said to the messengers who had come, "Say thus to the people of Jabesh-Gilead, Tomorrow we will be with you, to rescue you before the noon." The messengers accordingly went and informed the chiefs of Jabesh, and they were glad. So the chiefs of Jabesh said, "Tomorrow we will come out to you, and you can do to us what seems good in your eyes." In the morning, however, Saul divided his forces into 3 divisions, and advanced to the center of the camp in the morning watch, and assailed the Ammonites until noon of the day, and they were broken to pieces and fled, and no 2 of them held together. Then the force asked of Samuel, "Who said Saul should not be leader over us? Give those men to us, that we may kill them." Saul, however, replied, "Not a man shall be killed today, for today the ever-living has made a great deliverance for Israel." And Samuel said to the force, "March, and let us go to Gilgal, and renew the leadership there." All the force accordingly marched to Gilgal, and they elected Saul leader there before the ever-living in Gilgal, and sacrificed sacrifices of thanksgiving before the ever-living. And Saul and all the men of Israel rejoiced very greatly. Chapter 12. Samuel afterwards said to all Israel, "You see, I have listened to your voice in all you have asked me, and have appointed a leader over you, so now your leader can march before you. But I will govern in civil affairs. As for my sons, look, they are among you. And for myself, I have walked before you from my youth until this day. Here I am. Answer me before the ever-living, and before his anointed. Whose ox have I taken, or whose ass have I taken to be as a cover and blind to my eyes from any man? If I have, I will return it to you." And they replied, "You have neither defrauded us nor oppressed us, and you have never extorted anything whatever from the hand of anyone." Then he said to them, "The ever-living is a witness, and his anointed is a witness with you this day, that I have not taken anything whatever for my own hand." And they answered, "He is witness." So Samuel responded to the people, "It was the ever-living who appointed Moses and Aaron, and who brought your fathers from the land of Mizraim. Therefore now station yourselves, and I will relate to you before the ever-living all the beneficences of the ever-living which he has done for you, and for your fathers, from the time when Jacob came to the Mizraim, until when your ancestors cried to the ever-living, and the ever-living sent Moses and Aaron, and brought your fathers from the Mizraim, and fixed them in this place. Yet they forgot their ever-living God, so he sold them to the hand of Sisera, the general of the army of Katzor, and to the hands of the Philistine, and to the hand of the king of Moab, who fought with them. Then they cried to the ever-living and said, We have sinned, for we have forsaken the ever-living, and served the Baalim and Ashtaroth. But now deliver us from the power of our enemies, and we will serve you. So the ever-living sent Jerubbaal and the Danite, and Jephthah, and Samuel, and delivered you from the power of your enemies all around, and restored you to security. You have yourselves seen how Nachash, king of the Ammonites, came upon you when you said to me, We have no leader over us, though the ever-living God was your leader. So now, see the leader you have chosen, for whom you asked. The ever-living has now placed a leader over you. If you reverence the ever-living and serve him, and listen to his voice, and do not rebel against the utterance of the ever-living, then you and your leader who directs you will be in union with your ever-living God. But if you do not listen to the voice of the ever-living, but rebel against the direction of the ever-living, then the hand of the ever-living will be against you, as it was against your fathers. Stand therefore now, and see the great event which the ever-living will effect in your sight. Is it not wheat harvest at present? I will call to the ever-living, and he will send out the thunder and rain, that you may recognize and see how great a sin you committed in the sight of the ever-living, when you asked for a leader. Then Samuel called to the ever-living, and the ever-living sent thunder with rain at once, and all the people saw the greatness of the ever-living and of Samuel. Consequently all the assembly said to Samuel, Pray for your servants to your ever-living God, that we may not be killed, although we have added to all our offenses the sin of demanding a leader for ourselves. But Samuel replied to the people, Fear not, although you have done this wrong. Only do not turn away from the ever-living, but serve the ever-living with all your heart, and turn not after phantasms which cannot benefit or protect, for they are phantasms. The ever-living, however, will never forsake his people because of his great name, for the ever-living undertook to make you his people. As for myself, it would be a shame for me, a sin against the ever-living, if I ceased to pray for you and direct you in the way of honor and straightforwardness. So remember the ever-living, and serve him in truth with all your heart, for you see it is this which will make you great. But if you sin, then both you and your leader will decay. The end of chapters 7 through 12 of the first book of Samuel. Recording by Mark Penfold. The first book of Samuel, chapters 13 through 18. Chapter 13. When he had been leader over Israel to the 2nd year, Saul himself selected 3 regiments from Israel. And 2 regiments were retained with Saul in Michmash and in the hill of Bethel, and 1 regiment went with Jonathan to Gibeah of Benjamin. The remainder he sent away to their homes. Jonathan then attacked a garrison of the Philistine who were in Gibeah, and the Philistine heard of it. Saul consequently proclaimed by trumpet to all the country, saying, Let the Hebrews hear! So all Israel heard the news that Saul had defeated a garrison of the Philistine, and the people collected after Saul in Gilgal. The Philistine also prepared for war with Israel, 30,000 charioteers, and 6 regiments of cavalry, and infantry like sand on the seashore for number. And they advanced and encamped at Michmash to the east of Beth-aven. Then the man of Israel saw that there was trouble for them, because the army was cowed, and the people hid themselves in holes and caves and on cliffs, and in watchtowers and in bushes. And some flying away crossed over the Jordan to the country of Gad and Gilead. Yet Saul continued in Gilgal, and all his army trembled behind him. So he waited 7 days for the arrival of Samuel. But Samuel came not, and the people deserted from him. Saul consequently said, Bring me the burnt offering and peace offerings. And he offered the burnt offering. But when he had finished burning the offerings, then Samuel arrived. And Saul went out to ask him for his blessing. Samuel, however, exclaimed, What have you done? And Saul replied, Because I saw that the army was deserting from me, and you did not come to the periodical meeting, and that the Philistine had collected in Michmash, I said, Now the Philistine will come down upon me in Gilgal, and I have not approached the presence of the ever-living. So I forced myself and offered the burnt offering. But Samuel answered Saul, You have acted like a fool. You have not obeyed the command of your ever-living God which he commanded you. But if you had, the ever-living would have fixed the leadership over Israel to you absolutely. But now your leadership shall not be confirmed. The ever-living will seek himself a man after his own heart, and the ever-living will appoint him as leader over his people, because you have not regarded what the ever-living commanded you. Then Samuel arose and went up from Gilgal to Gibeah of Benjamin. Saul, however, mustered what force remained with him, but it was only about 600 men. Consequently Saul and Jonathan his son, and the force with them, retreated to Gibeah of Benjamin. but the Philistine encamped at Michmash. Thence Philistine plunderers went out from the camp in 3 divisions. One division turned to the direction of Aphrah in the lowlands, and another advanced towards Beth Koran, while the third advanced along the borders of the cliffs overlooking the plain of Tseboyim in the desert. At that time a smith was not allowed anywhere in Israel, for the Philistine said, "The Hebrews might make themselves swords or spears." Every one in Israel, therefore, went down to the Philistine to repair his coulter and plowshare, or axe, or chisel. But they were allowed files for the coulters and plowshares, and for the 3-pronged forks and billhooks, and to sharpen the prickers. Now, however, it was a time of war, yet no sword or spear was found in the hands of all the force who were with Saul and Jonathan, except that Saul and Jonathan his son had procured them. Thus the army of the Philistine had advanced beyond the environs of Michmash. Chapter 14. But one day Jonathan, Saul's son, said to the squire, his armor-bearer, "Let us go and pass over to the garrison of the Philistine that is on the other side of Laz." But he did not inform his father, for Saul was posted on the back of the hills, in the caves, the hollows that are in the cliffs, and the force with him was only about 600 men, with Achiah, ben Achitub, brother of Ichabod, ben Phinehas, ben Eli, the priest of the ever-living in Shiloh, who carried the ephod. So the force knew not that Jonathan had gone out. Now on the pass by which Jonathan sought to cross over to the garrison of the Philistine, there was a rock projecting into the pass on this side, and a rock projecting on the other side, and the name of the first was Betzetz, and the name of the other Saanah. The one projection was from the rock on the north opposite Michmash, and the other was from the south opposite the hill. So Jonathan said to the squire who carried his arms, "Let us go and cross over to the garrison of these blackguards. Perhaps the ever-living will help us, for there is no difference to the ever-living saving by many or few." And his arms-bearer answered him, "Do all that is in your heart. I will go with you as your heart desires." When Jonathan replied, "You see, we wish to pass over to these men, and to capture them. If therefore they say thus to us, 'Keep quiet until we come down to you,' then we will stand still below, and not go up to them. But if they say, 'Come up to us,' then we will go up, for the ever-living will give them into our hand, and that shall be the sign of it to us." When the two approached the garrison of the Philistine, and the Philistine cried out, "See, the Hebrews are coming from the holes where they have hidden themselves." And the men of the garrison shouted out to Jonathan and his arms-bearer, and said to them, "Come up to us, and we will teach you something." So Jonathan said to his squire, "Come up after me, for the ever-living has given them into the hand of Israel." Jonathan therefore climbed up on his hands and feet, with his squire after him, and they fell back before Jonathan and his squire, as if death followed after them. This was a great defeat when Jonathan and his squire slew some 20 men in an enclosure of about half an acre of ground. There was also a trembling in the camp, and in the ground, and in all the troops of the army, and the plunderers themselves also trembled, and there was an earthquake, for it was a divine terror. The watchmen with Saul in Gibeah of Benjamin also perceived the rumbling with horror, and staggered, and were as in a dream. Then Saul said to the force with him, "Muster now, and ascertain who has gone from us." They consequently mustered, and did not find Jonathan and his squire. Therefore Saul said to Abiah, "Approach the ark of God," for there was an ark of God in those days with Israel. And while Saul was speaking to the priest, a roaring came from the camp of the Philistine, and it rolled, and rolled, and raged. Then Saul said to the priest, "Take away your hand." And Saul and all the force who were with him cheered and advanced, and when they arrived at the camp, they saw the sword of each was against his companion in excessive confusion. For the Hebrews who served formerly with the Philistine had mutinied, and joined themselves with the Israelites who were with Saul and Jonathan. When all the men of Israel who had hidden in Mount Ephraim heard that the Philistine had fled and were routed, they also advanced to the battle, for the ever-living rescued Israel on that day. Thus the fighting passed on to Beth-aven, but the men of Israel were exhausted by that time. Saul therefore bound the army, saying, "Accursed be the man who eats food before dark, and who does not accompany me against my enemies." So none of the army tasted food. All the country was woodland. Honey lay openly on the ground, and the army came into the wood and saw the honeycomb, but no one put his hand to his mouth, for the people feared the curse. Jonathan, however, had not heard the curse of his father to the army, so he extended the end of the club that was in his hand, and dipped it into the honeycomb, and put his hand to his mouth, and his eyes were enlightened. But a man from among the forces remarked, "Your father bound the army and said, 'Accursed be the man who eats food today,' although the army was exhausted." But Jonathan answered, "My father troubles the army. Look now how my eyes are brightened by tasting this bit of honey. Indeed, why should not the army have eaten today of the spoil of its enemies which it found? For then would not the defeat of the Philistine have been increased?" However, they fought the Philistine that day from Michmash to Ailon, and the forces were greatly exhausted. So the men rushed on the booty, and seized sheep, and cows, and calves, and slaughtered them on the ground, and they ate with the blood. But it was reported to Saul, "Look, the people are offending the ever-living by eating with the blood." And he replied, "Prevent it. Roll to me at once a big stone." Then Saul added, "Serve out to the men, and command every man to bring his bullock to me, or his sheep, and kill them here and eat, without offending the ever-living by eating with the blood." So everyone brought his bullock along with him that night, and slaughtered it there. Saul also built an altar to the ever-living, for he had promised to build an altar to the ever-living. Then Saul said, "Let us follow after the Philistine by night, and assail them at dawn of the morning, and not leave a man of them." And they replied, "Do whatever seems right to you." But the priest said, "You must inquire about that of God." Saul therefore inquired of God, "Should I follow after the Philistine? Will you deliver them to the hand of Israel?" But he did not answer at that time. Consequently Saul exclaimed, "Let every squadron of the army come here to be examined, and show who has offended today. For by the life of the Lord, who has saved Israel, if it should be Jonathan my son, he shall be put to death." But there was no response from the whole force. Then he commanded all Israel, "You shall pass as one, and I and Jonathan my son shall be as one to pass." And the army answered Saul, "Do what is good in your sight." Saul therefore said, "Ever-living God of Israel, give a decision." Then Jonathan and Saul failed, but the army came out. Consequently Saul said, "Cause it to fall between me and my son Jonathan." And Jonathan failed. Therefore Saul said to Jonathan, "Tell me what you have done." So Jonathan told him, and said, "I tasted from the end of the club I had in my hand a little honey, and I must die?" And Saul replied, "God do the same to me, and more than this, if Jonathan is not put to death." But the army exclaimed to Saul, "Shall Jonathan be put to death, who has won this great victory for Israel tonight? As the Lord lives, not a hair shall fall from his head to the ground, for God worked today." And thus the army rescued Jonathan, so he did not die. Saul consequently went up from following the Philistine, and the Philistine returned to their quarters. Saul in this way won the leadership over Israel, and fought around with all his enemies. With Moab, and the Beni Ammon, and with Edom, and with the kings of Zobah, and with the Philistine, and whoever stood up against him, he conquered. He also formed an army and defeated Amalek, and delivered Israel out of the power of its ravages. And the sons of Saul were Jonathan, and Ishur, and Malchishua, and the names of his 2 daughters were Merab the eldest, and Michal the youngest. And the name of Saul's wife was Achinam, the daughter of Achimatz. And the names of the commanders of his armies, Abiner ben Ner, uncle of Saul, and Kish the father of Saul, and Ner, Abner ben Abiel. And there was fierce war with the Philistine all the time of Saul. So if Saul saw any brave man, or any capable man, he took him to himself. Chapter 15. For Samuel had said to Saul, "The ever-living sent me to you to anoint you as a leader over his people Israel. So now listen to the sound of the words of the ever-living. Thus says the Lord of hosts, I remember what Amalek did to Israel when he placed himself in the path of their going up from the Mitzrayim. Therefore go and assail the Amalekites, and destroy all belonging to them, and you shall not pity over it, but kill both man and woman, both child and nurse, both ox and sheep, both camel and ass." So Saul and the forces obeyed, and mustered in Telaim 200,000 regulars and 10,000 of the men of Judah. And Saul advanced to the city of Amalek, and fought at the brook. Then Saul said to the Kenites, "Go from among the Amalekites, for fear I should account you as their allies, although you showed kindness to all the children of Israel on their ascent from the Mizraim." The Kenites accordingly departed from the Amalekites. Then Saul conquered Amalek from Havilah to the passage of the wall which is along the border of the Mizraim. He also captured Agag, the king of Amalek, alive, but he destroyed all the army by the edge of the sword. Saul and the forces, however, spared Agag and the best of the sheep and cattle, and wethers, and fat lambs, and all that was good, and were not willing to destroy them, but they destroyed all the worthless and poor cattle. Consequently a message came from the ever-living to Samuel, to say, "It grieves me that I appointed Saul as leader, for he has turned from following me, and he does not stand by my command." But it hurt Samuel, and he cried to the ever-living all night. Samuel, however, got up in the morning to meet Saul, for it had been reported to Samuel that Saul had come to Carmel, and fixed a garrison for himself, then turned aside and had gone to Gilgal. And when Samuel came to Saul, Saul said to him, "Give thanks. I have stood by the command of the ever-living." But Samuel replied, "Then what is this bleating of sheep in my ears, and the lowing of cattle which I hear?" And Saul answered, "They come from the Amalekites, since the army spared the best of the sheep and cattle for the purpose of sacrificing to your ever-living God, but we destroyed the rest." Samuel, however, exclaimed to Saul, "Stop, and I will tell you what the ever-living said to me last night." And he replied, "Tell it." So Samuel said, "Were you not little in your own eyes, you head of the tribes of Israel, when the ever-living anointed you to be leader over Israel? And the ever-living sent you on a journey and said, 'Go and destroy those sinners the Amalekites, and fight with them to destruction.' Now why have you not listened to the voice of the ever-living? You have pounced upon the plunder, and done wrong in the sight of the ever-living." But Saul replied to Samuel, "I did listen to the voice of the ever-living, and went on the journey the ever-living sent me, and I have brought Agag the king of Amalek, but I have destroyed the Amalekites. The army, however, made prize of the best sheep and cattle to be devoted as a sacrifice to your ever-living God in Gilgal." Samuel, however, said to Saul, "Is it more pleasing to the ever-living to have offerings and sacrifices than to listen to the voice of the Lord? Look, to listen is better than sacrifice, and to obey than the fat of rams. For the result of your idea is rebellion, and delusion, and stubborn idolatry. You have repudiated the command of the ever-living, and he repudiates you from being leader." Then Saul exclaimed to Samuel, "I have sinned, because I have passed by the command of the ever-living, and your command. But I feared the army, and I listened to their voice. Yet now I pray you to pardon my fault, and come along with me, and I will humble myself to the ever-living." But Samuel answered Saul, "I will not go with you, for you repudiated the command of the ever-living, so the ever-living has repudiated you from being leader over Israel." Then Samuel turned to go, but he seized him by the hood of his cloak, and it tore. And Samuel exclaimed, "The ever-living has torn the leadership of Israel from off you today, and has given it to your neighbor, a better than you. He who presides over Israel does not lie and does not alter, for he is not a man that he should alter." Still he replied, "I have sinned. Yet honor me in the presence of the officers of my army, and in the presence of Israel, and come along with me, and I will bow to your ever-living God." Samuel consequently went with Saul, and Saul bowed to the ever-living. Samuel afterward said, "Bring Agag the king of Amalek to me." And Agag advanced tottering to him. And Agag said, "Surely the bitterness of death has passed." But Samuel answered, "As your sword has made women childless, so your mother shall be childless among women." Then Samuel hewed Agag to pieces before the ever-living in Gilgal. Samuel afterwards went to Ramoth, and Saul went up to his house at Gibeah of Saul. And Samuel ceased to visit Saul to the day of his death, for Samuel was grieved at Saul, and the ever-living was sorry for the rule of Saul over Israel. Chapter 16. The ever-living consequently said to Samuel, "How long will you grieve about Saul? Although I have rejected him from the leadership over Israel. Fill your horn with oil and go. I send you to Jessai of Bethlehem, for I have selected a leader for myself from among his sons." But Samuel replied, "If I go and Saul hears, he will murder me." The ever-living, however, answered, "Take an heifer from the herd with you, and say, I have come to sacrifice to the ever-living. And invite Jessai to the sacrifice, when I will instruct you what to do. Then anoint for me whoever I tell you." Samuel accordingly did what the ever-living told him, and went to Bethlehem. And the magistrate of the town came to meet him, and asked, "Do you come with peace?" And he replied, "With peace. I have come to sacrifice to the ever-living. Purify yourselves, and come with me to the sacrifice. Let Jessai and his sons also purify themselves." Thus he invited them to the sacrifice. And when they came, he looked on Eliab, and thought, "Ah, he must be consecrated before the ever-living." But the ever-living said, "Do not bend to look at his great stature, for I reject him. For what a man does not see, because a man looks with his eyes, but the ever-living looks with his heart." Then Jessai called Abinadab, and passed him before the face of Samuel, when he said, "Him also the ever-living does not choose." Then Jessai passed 7 of his sons before Samuel, when Samuel said to Jessai, "The ever-living has not chosen any of these." But Samuel asked of Jessai, "Are these all your lads?" And he replied, "All except the youngest, and he is shepherding with the sheep." Samuel, however, said to Jessai, "Send and bring him, for I will not dine until he comes here." So he sent and brought him, and he was ruddy, with handsome eyes, and beautiful to look at. Then the ever-living said, "Arise, anoint him, for this is he." Samuel therefore took the horn of oil, and consecrated him in preference to his brothers. And the Spirit of the ever-living came upon David from that day forward. Samuel afterwards arose and returned to Ramah. The Spirit of the ever-living then went away from Saul, and he was terrified by an evil spirit away from the Lord. The ministers of Saul consequently said to him, "Now that the Spirit of God has gone, an evil spirit terrifies you. Let our Lord then command your personal servants to seek a man skillful in playing on the harp, and when the evil spirit from God is upon you, he can play with his hand and ease you." Saul consequently replied to his ministers, "Look out then for me a man with proficiency in music, and bring him to me." "I have seen a son of Jessai of Bethlehem, a skillful musician, a fine dancer, a gentleman and a good reciter, and a handsome man, and the ever-living is with him." Saul therefore sent messengers to Jessai, and said, "Send your son David, who goes with the flock, to me." So Jessai put on an ass bread, and a skin of wine, with a kid of the goats, and sent them by the hand of his son David to Saul. When David came to Saul and was presented to him, he admired him greatly, and he became one of his attendants. And Saul sent to Jessai to say, "Let David attend me, for he has found favor in my sight." When therefore the Spirit from God came upon Saul, David took his harp and played with his hand, and relieved Saul, and soothed him, so that the evil spirit went from him. Chapter 17. But the Philistine assembled in their camps for war. They advanced to Sukkah, which is in Judah, and were encamped between Sukkah and Azkah in Aphes Damim. Saul and the Israelites also collected and encamped on the plain of Halah, and they prepared for battle at the challenge of the Philistine. But the Philistine occupied the hill beyond, with the vale between them. And there came out from the camp of the Philistine a man, one of the twins, whose name was Goliath of Gath. His height was 6 cubits and a half. A brass helmet was on his head, and he was clothed in a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of brass, with brass greaves on his legs, and brazen javelins at his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and the spike of his spear weighed 600 shekels of iron. A shield-bearer marched in front of him. Thus he stood, and called from a distance to the regiments of Israel, and said to them, "Why do you come out arrayed for battle?
Am not I a Philistine, and you slaves of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come to me. If he is able to fight me and beat me, then we will be your slaves. But if I overpower him and beat him, then you shall be slaves for us."
The Philistine also said,
"I defy all the regiments of Israel today. Give me a man that we may fight together." Ha ha ha.
And Saul and all Israel listened to these words of the Philistine, and were depressed and terribly afraid. A man of Ephrah, of Bethlehem Judah, whose name was Jessai, had 8 sons, one of them David. And the man in the days of Saul was looked on as a great man by the people. The 3 elder sons of Jessai had gone and marched with Saul to the war: Eliab the eldest, and the second Abinadab, and the third Shammah. David was the youngest. So the 3 elder marched after Saul. For David had returned and left attending Saul to shepherd the flock of his father at Bethlehem. The Philistine had thus approached and stationed himself morning and afternoon for 40 days, when Jessai said to David his son,
"Take now for your brothers an ephah of this oatmeal and these 10 cakes, and run to the camp to your brothers. Present also these 10 rolls of butter to the colonel of the regiment, and wish your brothers health, and take their returns."
Saul and all the army of Israel were then on the plain of Halah, at war with the Philistine. David consequently arose at dawn, and entrusted the flock to the keeper, and started, and went as Jessai had ordered, and came to the wagon station, when the forces were going out in battle array, and were cheering for the fight. Both Israel and the Philistine were arrayed for fight, ready for the challenge. So David entrusted the baggage he had brought with him to the care of the baggage guard, and ran to the ranks, and went and wished his brothers health. And while he was in talk with them, he saw the champion of the Philistine, named Goliath of Gath, approach from the side of the Philistine, and saw what he did. And David listened. But all the Israelites were afraid of the man, and fled before him in great terror. And a soldier of Israel was saying to the lookers-on, "Do you see this man who is coming up there, who comes up to defy Israel? But should a man be able to defeat him, the king will enrich him with great wealth, and give him his daughter, and make his father's family tax-free in Israel." So David asked of the men who stood around him, "Say, what will be done to the man who defeats that Philistine, and removes his insults from Israel? For who is this Philistine blackguard who defies the armies of the living God?" When the people replied to him to this effect, saying, "Thus it will be done to the man who defeats him." But Eliab his elder brother listened to his talking with the men, and Eliab was furious with David, and exclaimed, "For what have you come down here? And to whom have you entrusted those few sheep in the desert? I know your pride and the bravado of your heart. You have come for the sake of seeing the battle." David, however, answered, "What have I done now? Is there not a cause?" And he turned from beside him, and went a little backward, and asked to the same effect. And the people returned him word for word, as at first. But the inquiries that David made were heard, and were reported to Saul, and he had him fetched. David said to Saul, "Let no man's heart drop because of him. Your servant will go and fight this Philistine." But Saul replied to David, "You are not fit to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are a lad, and he has been a man of war from his youth." David, however, answered Saul, "Your servant was a shepherd of the flock to his father, and a lion came, and a bear, and carried off some of the flock. But I went out after them, and beat them, and delivered them from their mouth. Then they leaped upon me, but I seized them by the mane, and beat and killed them. Your servant beat both the lion and the bear, and it will be with this filthy Philistine the same as with them, for he defies the regiments of the living God. And," David added, "the ever-living who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear can deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." Then Saul said to David, "Go, and the ever-living be with you." And Saul clothed David in his own armor, and put a helmet of brass on his head, clad him in a coat of mail, and girt David with a sword from his own arms. Then he tried to walk, but he was not able. David therefore said to Saul, "I am not able to walk in these, for I have never been used to them." Consequently David stripped them off him, took his sling in his hand, and chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook, and put them into a shepherd's bag that he had. So with the sling and staff in his hand he approached the Philistine. The Philistine also himself marched and advanced against David, with the man carrying a big shield in front of him. But when the Philistine bent forward and saw David, he despised him, for he was a lad and ruddy with a beautiful face. So the Philistine said to David,
Am I a dog, that you come to me with sticks?
Then the Philistine cursed David by his God. The Philistine also exclaimed to David,
Come to me, and I will give your carcass to the fowls of the sky and to the beasts of the field.
But David replied to the Philistine, You come against me with sword and spears and in armor, but I come against you with the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the regiments of Israel, whom you have defied. The Lord will shut you up today for my hand, and I will beat you and cut off your head and give the carcass of the champion of the Philistine today to the birds of the sky and the wild beasts of the earth, and all the world shall know that there is a God for Israel. And all the crowd shall recognize that the ever-living saves neither by sword or spears, for the Lord controls the war, and will give you into our hands. Then the Philistine braced himself up and advanced to challenge David. But David was quick and ran from the ranks to attack the Philistine. And thrusting his hand into his bag, David took out a stone and slung it, and hit the Philistine on the forehead, and the stone entered his forehead, and he fell on his face to the ground. Thus David was victorious over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. But there was no sword in David's hand, so David ran and stood by the Philistine, and seized his sword and drew it from his sheath, and killed him, and cut his head off with it. When the Philistines saw that their hero was dead, they fled. Then the generals of Israel and Judah arose and cheered, and pursued the Philistine to the end of the valley and to the gates of Akron. And the wounded of the Philistine fell on the road of the double gates, both of Gath and Akron. Then the Israelites returned from the pursuit after the Philistine and plundered their camp. David ultimately took the head of the Philistine and brought it to the house of peace, and placed his armor in the hall. But Saul, watching David going to challenge the Philistine, said to Abner, the commander of his army,
Whose son is that lad, Abner?
And Abner answered,
By your soul's life, leader, if I know.
Then the leader said,
Inquire yourself whose son the youth is.
So when David returned from defeating the Philistine, Abner took him before Saul, the head of the Philistine being in his hand. And Saul asked him,
Whose son are you, my lad?
David replied, The son of your servant Jessai of Bethlehem. Chapter 18. And as he finished speaking with Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan admired him like his own self. Saul also took to him at that time, and would not permit him to return to his father's house. Then Jonathan and David made a treaty to love each other as their own life. And Jonathan took off the cloak that he had on him, and put it upon David with his armor, and sword, and bow, and belt. And David went wherever Saul sent him, and was successful, and pleasing to Saul above all the officers of the army, and he was delightful in the eyes of all the people, and also in the eyes of the ministers of Saul. It happened, however, that once when David was returning from defeating the Philistine, that women came out from all the towns of Israel with song and dances to meet King Saul, with tambourines, tom-toms, and triangles, when the women answered to the music and sung, Saul has defeated his thousands, and David his 10,000s. But Saul was very angry, and the refrain was hateful in his ears. So he exclaimed,
They have given the 10,000s to David, and the thousands to me. What is there more for him except the leadership?
Saul consequently became irritable with David from that time forward. Then some time after the evil spirit from God seized upon Saul, as he was walking through his palace, and David was playing on his harp as he did daily, and Saul had javelins in his hand. So Saul threw javelins, exclaiming, I will pin David to the wall. But David escaped them twice. Then Saul became frightened at the presence of David, for the ever-living had come to him and gone away from Saul. Therefore Saul removed him from near himself, and appointed him colonel of a regiment, and he went out and came in with the forces. David, however, went on his way successfully, for the ever-living was with him. And Saul saw that he was very successful, and was afraid of him. For all Israel and Judah admired David, for he went out and came back before them. Saul consequently said to David,
"You know my elder daughter Merab. I will give her to you for a wife, and you shall become my most powerful son, and fight the battles of the ever-living."
But Saul intended not that he should become powerful, but that he might be brought into the power of the Philistine. David, however, replied to Saul, "Who am I? And what is the clan of my father in Israel, that I should become son-in-law to the chieftain?" But when the time came for giving Merab, Saul's daughter, to David, she was given in marriage to Adriel, the Mecholathite. But Michal, Saul's daughter, loved David, and told it to Saul, and it seemed right in his opinion. So Saul said, "I will promise her to him, and she shall be a trap for him, that he may be got into the hands of the Philistine." Saul therefore said to David a second time, "You shall be my son-in-law now." Saul also ordered his ministers to speak to David privately, and say, "The leader is now your friend, and all his ministers like you. So now become son-in-law to the chieftain." Therefore the ministers of Saul whispered their ideas to David. But David replied, "Is it a little matter in your sight to be son-in-law to the leader, when I am a common and ordinary man?" So his ministers reported to Saul himself how David had replied to the matter. Saul accordingly answered, "Say this to David: the leader does not care for a dowry, but wishes for 100 foreskins of the Philistine as a revenge on the king's enemies." But Saul was plotting to throw David into the hands of the Philistine. His ministers therefore reported this speech to David, and the idea to be son-in-law to the chieftain was capital in David's view. But the opportunity did not arrive. Therefore David prepared and marched, he and his men, and killed 200 persons of the Philistine, and David brought their foreskins, thus satisfying the leader, and thus justifying his being made his son-in-law. Saul then gave him Michal his daughter as a wife. Saul also saw and acknowledged that the ever-living was with David, and that Michal his daughter loved him. Saul, however, still continued to be afraid of David, and Saul was an enemy to David all the time. When the Philistine generals advanced, David's strategy was more skillful against them than that of any of the officers of Saul, so his name became famous. The end of chapters 13 through 18 of the first book of Samuel. Recording by Mark Penfold. The first book of Samuel, chapters 19 through 24. Chapter 19. Saul consequently ordered his son Jonathan and all his officers to kill David. But Jonathan, Saul's son, had a great admiration for David. So Jonathan informed David, telling him, "My father Saul is trying to get you killed. So look out now in the morning, and keep yourself in the house, and do not come out. But I will go and station myself beside my father at the parade, where you should be, and I will talk about you to my father, and will watch the result and report it to you." Jonathan accordingly spoke well about David to his father Saul, and said to him, "Do not let the king hurt David, his officer, for he has not injured you, but has done you very great services. For he put his life in his hand and assailed the Philistine. The ever-living effected a great victory for all Israel, and you saw it, and were glad. So why now sin against innocent blood by killing David without a cause?" Saul listened to the voice of Jonathan, and Saul swore, "By the life of the Lord, he shall not be killed." Jonathan afterwards went to David, and reported to him the whole conversation. Jonathan also brought David to Saul, and he associated with him as formerly. When there was war again, David went out and fought with the Philistine, and defeated them with a crushing defeat, so that they fled before him. Then the evil spirit from the ever-living came upon Saul, and he sat in his room with his javelin in his hand, while David was playing. And Saul tried to pin David with his javelin to the wall, but he rushed from Saul's presence, and the javelin fastened itself in the wall. So David fled and hid himself that night. Saul, however, sent troops to David's house to keep watch and kill him in the morning. But Michal his wife informed David, saying, "If you do not save your life tonight, you will be killed tomorrow." So Michal let David down out of a window, and he successfully escaped and hid himself. Then Michal took the teraphim and put them on the bed, with a goat's beard laid for its beard, and covered it with clothing. So when Saul sent his guards to seize David, she said, "He is ill." Saul, however, sent messengers to see David himself, saying, "Bring him on his bed to me, that I may kill him." But when the messengers came, they found the teraphim in the bed, with a goat's beard on its face. Then Saul demanded of Michal, "Why have you deluded me thus, and let my enemy escape from me and hide himself?" And Michal answered Saul, "He said to me, 'Let me escape, or I will kill you.'" Thus David escaped and hid himself, and went to Samuel at Ramah, and informed him of all Saul had done to him. There he stayed with Samuel, and they resided in the residency. But it was reported to Saul that David was at the residency at Ramah. Saul consequently sent messengers to arrest David, but when they saw the company of reciters reciting, and Samuel standing up directing them, the divine spirit came upon Saul's messengers, and they themselves recited. And they reported it to Saul, who sent other messengers, but they also recited. Saul, however, again sent messengers a third time, and they also recited. Then he went himself to Ramah, and when he came to the great cistern that is at Sikah, he asked, inquiring, "Where are Samuel and David?" and was told, "They are at his house near Ramah." But when he went to the house near Ramah, then the divine spirit came upon him also, and he went dancing and reciting until he came to the residency at Ramah. He also tore off his clothes, and himself recited before Samuel, and fell down naked there all that day and all that night. From this comes the saying, "Is Saul also among the reciters?" Chapter 20. Then David removed from the residency at Ramah, and appeared before Jonathan, asking him, "What have I done? What is my fault? And how have I offended your father, that he seeks my life?" And he replied to him, "Be calm, you shall not be killed. Look, my father does nothing great or little that he does not communicate to my ears. Then why should my father hide this affair? It cannot be so." But David swore even, and said, "He knows, your father knows, that I have found favor in your eyes. So he says, 'Let not Jonathan know this, for fear he should be grieved.' But however, by the life of the ever-living, and by the life of your soul, what defense is there between me and death?" Then Jonathan asked David, "What do you demand about your life? And I will provide it for you." And David replied to Jonathan, "You know tomorrow is new moon, and I should sit with the king to dine, but I will withdraw and keep myself in the country until the third evening. If your father inquires for me, you must say, 'David asked me permission to run to Bethlehem, his village, for it is the set time for all his clan to sacrifice there.' If he then says, 'Good,' there is safety for your servant. But if it angers him, you will know that evil has been determined by him. Now act kindly to your friend, for you have made a bond of the ever-living between your friend and yourself. But if I have offended, kill me yourself, for why should you betray me to your father?" Then Jonathan answered, "Go away, calm yourself, and if I find that injury is intended to be brought upon you from my father, I will come to you." But David replied to Jonathan, "Whatever he said to me, or may assert to you, your father is determined." When Jonathan replied to David, "Come, and we will go into the fields." So they both went to the fields, where Jonathan said to David, "By the ever-living, the God of Israel, I will search out my father by this time, at 3 days after tomorrow, and find if he is good towards David. And if he is not, I will send to you and whisper it to you. The Lord do so to Jonathan, and more than that, if what is pleasant to my father is bad for you. I will inform you of it, and send you away, and you shall depart in safety. May the ever-living be with you, as he has been with my father. Therefore, you must not, whilst I live, ever fail to show me the mercy of the ever-living, and not kill me. Let not your mercy cease from my family forever, not even when the ever-living cuts off every single enemy of David from the face of the earth. For Jonathan makes a treaty with the house of David, and the ever-living will inquire for it from the hand of David's enemies." Then Jonathan proceeded to swear David by his friendship for him, for he loved him as the friend of his life. Jonathan also said to him, "Tomorrow is new moon, so guard yourself, for your house will be watched. But upon the third day come down cautiously, and go to the place where you hid yourself on the day of sacrifice, and seat yourself at the side of the rock of Azel, and I will shoot 3 arrows at random with a pretense of exercising myself at the butts. Then I will send my lad to go seek the arrows. But if I say to the youth, Look, the arrows are near you, then get yourself up and come, for you will be safe, and there is nothing, as the Lord lives. But if I say to the boy, Look out, for the arrows are beyond you and further on, you must fly, for the ever-living sends you away. The bond we have bound ourselves by, you and I, remember, for the ever-living is the intermediary between myself and you forever. David consequently hid himself in the fields. When the new moon came, the king sat down to table to dine. And the king sat on his usual seat by the wall, when Jonathan came up. But Abner had seated himself at the table of Saul, who missed the presence of David. Saul, however, said nothing himself about it that day, for he reflected something has happened to him. Perhaps he is not clean. He has not been ready. When the second day after the new moon came, and he still missed the presence of David, Saul asked Jonathan his son, Why has not the son of Jesse come today as formerly to dine? And Jonathan replied to Saul, David asked me if he might go to Bethlehem, and said, Permit me, I pray, for our clan sacrifices in that village, and my brother has sent for me, and so, if I have found favor in your sight, allow me, I pray, for I wish to see my brothers. That is why he has not come to the king's table. But Saul was furious with Jonathan, and exclaimed to him, You young son of rebellion, do I not know that you have chosen the son of Jesse to your own dishonor, and to the dishonor of your mother's shame? For as long as the son of Jesse exists above ground, your leadership will not be secured. And now you have sent and taken him from me. Nevertheless, he is a son of death. Jonathan, however, answered Saul his father, and said to him, Why should he die? What has he done? Then Saul threw his javelin at him to stab him. So Jonathan knew that his father had decided upon the death of David. So Jonathan arose from the table with fury, and ate no food the second day of the new moon, for he was grieved about David, because his father had thus determined. But when dawn came, Jonathan went out to the field to meet David, and a little lad with him, and he said to his lad, Run, find the arrows I shoot. The boy ran, so he shot an arrow to pass over him. When the lad came to the place to which the arrow had been shot by Jonathan, Jonathan called after the lad and said, Halloo! Is not my arrow there beyond you? Jonathan also called after the lad, Make haste, be quick, don't dawdle. So the lad picked up the arrows of Jonathan and came to his master. The lad, however, knew nothing about the affair. Jonathan and David, however, understood the thing. Then Jonathan gave his weapons to his boy and said to him, Go, return to the town. The lad went, and David got up from his hiding place, and bending his face to the earth, bowed 3 times, and both kissed as friends, and both wept as friends, until David was overcome. Then Jonathan said to David, Go in the peace that we both have sworn to by the name of the ever-living, saying, The ever-living shall be between me and you, and between my descendants and your descendants forever. Chapter 21. Then he arose and departed, and Jonathan returned to the town. David then went to Achimelech the priest at Nob, but Achimelech hesitated to receive David, and asked him, Why are you alone, and no one with you? So David answered Achimelech the priest, The king ordered me on a business, and said to me, Let no one know what the business is on which I send you, nor what I have ordered you. So I appointed another place for my men. And now what have you got here? Give me those 5 cakes, or I shall take them myself. But the priest replied to David and said, It is not common bread that is under my care, but consecrated bread. If the young men have kept themselves, however, from women. And David answered the priest and said, Women have not approached us for 3 days since I set out. The accouterments of the men are clean, and the way open, and indeed my accouterments were cleaned that day. Then the priest gave him the consecrated bread, for he had no other bread there, except the bread of the presentation taken away from the piles before the ever-living, to be replaced by hot bread on the day that he took it. There was, however, at the same time an officer of Saul's resting before the ever-living, named Doeg the Edomite, the chief of Saul's shepherds. And David asked Achimelech, Is there not here in your custody a spear or sword? For I could not bring my sword or my arms with me, for the order of the king was very urgent. The priest replied, The sword of Goliath the Philistine, whom you defeated on the plain of Halah, is here, wrapped in a cloth behind his armor. If you will take that, "Take it, for there is not another except it here." And David replied, "There is none like it. Give it to me." Then David arose and fled at once from the neighborhood of Saul, and went to Achish, king of Gath. But the officers of Achish said to him, "Is not this David the leader of the country? Was it not about him they sang in the dances, saying, 'Saul has defeated his thousands, but David his 10,000s?'" And David put these words into his heart, and was very terrified in the presence of Achish, king of Gath. So he altered his way of talking in their sight, and acted the fool towards them, and scribbled on the panels of the doors, and dribbled his spittle on his beard. Achish consequently said to his officers, "You see the man is mad. Why have you brought him to me? Have I need of fools that you have brought this one to me to play the fool for me? Let him get out of my house." Chapter 22. Then David went from that place, and took refuge in the caves of Adullam, and his relatives heard of it, and they and all his father's family went down to him there. And every man in distress, and every man in debt, and every man of discontented mind collected to him, and he became a captain over them, until there were about 400 men with him in the caves. But David went from there to Mitzvah of Moab, and said to the king of Moab, "I beg you to allow my father and mother to be with you, until I learn what God will do with me." So the king of Moab granted it, and they stayed with him all the time that David was in the stronghold. Then Gad the reciter said to David, "Do not remain in this stronghold, but go to the land of Judah." So David went and came to the wood of Kareth. Saul, however, heard this, for David and the men who were with him were known, and Saul was resting on a hill under a tamarisk tree in Ramah, with his spear in his hand, and all his officers were standing about him. So Saul said to the officers who were around him, "Listen now, all you sons of thieves. I gave to the son of Jesse farms and vineyards, as I did to all of you. I made you my colonels of regiments and my captains of companies. So why have you, all of you, conspired against me, and not opened my ears to the agreement of my son with the son of Jesse? And have you not shown it to me, or informed me that my son had set my slave above myself secretly, as he is today?" Then Doeg the Edomite replied. He stood amongst the ministers of Saul, and said, "I saw the son of Jesse go to Nobah, to Achimelech the son of Achitub, who inquired for him of the ever-living, and gave him provisions, and handed him also the sword of Goliath the Philistine." The king consequently sent and summoned Achimelech ben Achitub the priest, and the whole of the priests of his father's family who were in Nobah, and they all came to the king, when Saul said, "Listen now, Ben Achitub." And he replied, "I am here, my prince." Then Saul asked him, "Why did you and the son of Jesse, hide from me that you supplied him with bread and a sword, and inquired for him of God, to rise against me in secret, as he now does?" But Achimelech answered the king, and said, "Who of all your officers should be more honorably trusted than David, a royal son-in-law, and the chief of your subjects, and the most honored of your family? Upon the day when I danced to inquire of God for him, I did dance. Let not the king bring trouble upon his servant with all my father's family, for your servant knew nothing of all this affair, little or great." The leader, however, replied, "You shall die, Achimelech, you and all your father's family." And the leader commanded the guards around him to turn upon them and slay the priests of the ever-living for helping David, and because knowing of his flight they had not informed him. But the officers of the king would not go, would not extend their hands to strike the priests of the ever-living. Then the leader said to Doeg, "Get up and fall upon the priests." So Doeg the Edomite turned and fell upon the priests himself, and killed on that day 85 men who bore the ephods only. He also assailed Nob, the towns of the priests, with the edge of the sword, both men and women, child and infant, and ox and ass and sheep, he massacred. But one son of Achimelech ben Achitub escaped, whose name was Abiathar, and fled to David, and Abiathar informed David how Saul had murdered the priests of the ever-living. And David said to Abiathar, "I knew on that day when Doeg the Edomite was there that he would inform Saul. I am responsible for all the lives of your father's family. Stay with me, fear not, for he who seeks my life seeks yours as well, so you have a place of safety with me. Chapter 23. They reported once to David, saying, "The Philistine are besieging Keilah and destroying the cornfields." So David inquired of the ever-living, asking, "Shall I assail and defeat those Philistine?" And the ever-living answered David, "Go and defeat the Philistine and relieve Keilah." But David's men said to him, "Look you, we are in terror here in Judah, so why should we go to Keilah to fight the regulars of the Philistine?" Therefore David repeated the enquiry to the ever-living, when the ever-living answered, "Arise, march to Keilah, for I will give the Philistine into your power." David and his men then marched to Keilah and fought with the Philistine, and captured their baggage train and defeated them with great slaughter. Thus David saved the inhabitants of Keilah. And when Abiathar ben Achitub followed David to Keilah, he took the ephod with him. It was, however, reported to Saul that David had come to Keilah, so Saul remarked, "God has betrayed him into my power, for he is prevented by doors and bars from leaving the town." Saul therefore ordered all his forces for war to descend to Keilah to assail David and his men. But David had intelligence that Saul was planning evil against him, so he said to Abiathar the priest, "Bring the ephod here." Then David prayed, "Ever-living God of Israel, listen to your servant, for Saul seeks to advance upon Keilah to destroy the town because of me. Will the headmen of Keilah deliver me into his power? Will Saul descend as your servant has heard? Living God of Israel, inform your servant, I pray." The ever-living answered, "He will descend." Then David asked, "Will the headmen of Keilah deliver me and my men into the power of Saul?" And the ever-living replied, "They will deliver." Consequently David and his men, about 600 persons, arose and went out from Keilah and dispersed as they could. And it was reported to Saul that David had escaped from Keilah, so he stopped his advance. Then David stayed in the dens of the desert and occupied a hill in the desert of Ziph, and Saul hunted him all his days, but God gave him not into his power. David also knew when Saul came out to seek him, but David kept in concealment in the desert of Ziph. Jonathan, however, the son of Saul, arose and went to David secretly, and cheered him up in God, and said to him, "Fear not, for the hand of my father Saul will not catch you, and you will be the leader of Israel, and I will be your lieutenant. My father Saul also knows this." Then both of them made a treaty before the ever-living, but David continued in hiding, and Jonathan returned to his home. The Ziphites, however, went up to Saul to Gibeah to say, "Do you not know that David is hiding with us in a fort concealed among the hills of Keilah on the south of the desert? So now, with all the energy of your soul, commander, come down, and we will deliver him to the commander's hand." When Saul answered, "May you be blessed by the ever-living for your kindness to me. Go, I pray, ascertain further and learn, and watch the places that he haunts, who sees him there, for they tell me he is very crafty. Examine and learn also about all the hiding places where he haunts, and report them to me accurately. Then I will come to you, and if he is skulking about in the country, I will chase him with all the regiments of Judah." They accordingly arose and went from the audience with Saul to Ziph. But David and his men were then in the desert of Maon, in the waste to the south of the desert, where Saul and his men marched in pursuit. But David received intelligence of it, and came down from the hill fort and rested in the desert of Maon. Saul, however, heard of this, and pursued after David to the desert of Maon. But Saul marched on one side of the hill, and David and his men on the other side of the hill, with David hurrying in his march from the approach of Saul. For Saul and his men wished to surround David and his men, and capture them. Then a messenger rushed to Saul, saying, "Make haste and march, for the Philistine have burst into the country." Saul therefore ceased the pursuit after David, and went to encounter the Philistine, in consequence of which that place is called the Peak of Turnagain. Chapter 24. From there David went and settled in the fort of Engedi. Again, when Saul returned from after the Philistine, he was informed that David was in the desert of Engedi. So Saul took 3,000 men, the choice of all Israel, and marched to seek David and his men in the high peaks of Jalim. When he came to the sheepfolds by the road, where there is a cave, Saul went in to rest his feet. But David and his men were in the backward reaches of the caves. Then David's men said to him, "Now is the time that the ever-living said to you, 'I will put your enemy into your power, and you can do to him whatever is good in your eyes.'" So David arose and took away the embroidered quilt with which Saul was covered. But afterwards David's heart reproved him for taking away the quilt which was on Saul, and he said to his men, "Trouble will come to me from the ever-living if I do such a thing to my prince, to the Lord's anointed, as to lay my hand upon him. For he has been consecrated to the ever-living." David consequently restrained his men from action and would not allow them to attack Saul. So Saul left the cave and proceeded on his way. Then David got up and went out of the cave and called after Saul and said, "My lord, commander!" When Saul looked behind him, David bent his face earthward and bowed to him. David then said to Saul, "Why do you listen to the tales of the man who says, 'David seeks to do you injury'? Look, this very day your eyes can see that the ever-living gave you into my power in the cave, and they wished to murder you. But I pitied you and said, 'I will not lift my hand against my prince, for he has been consecrated to the ever-living.' And now, father, see, look, here is the embroidered quilt that covered you in my hand. I took the quilt away from you, but did not murder you. Know and be convinced, therefore, that there is no wrong in my hand, or rebellion, or sin against you. Yet you hunt for my life to take it. Let the ever-living decide between me and you, when the ever-living will acquit me rather than you, for my hand has not been against you. As the verse of the Cadmonite says, 'From the wicked, wickedness springs, but my hand shall not be against you.' After what does the commander of Israel come out? After what do you chase? After a dead dog, after a single flea. But let the ever-living be judge and decide between me and you, and examine my cause, and acquit me from you." And when David had finished uttering this address to Saul, Saul asked, "Is that your voice, my son David?" Then Saul lifted up his voice and wept, and said to David, "You are more righteous than I, for you have repaid me with benefit, but I have repaid you with violence. And further, you have shown it today by having acted kindly to me, for when the ever-living had delivered me to your power, you did not kill me. For when did a man find his enemy and helped him kindly on his way? The ever-living, however, will repay you generously in return for what you have done to me. And indeed I know that you will lead, and that the leadership of Israel will be fixed in your hand. Therefore swear to me by the ever-living not to destroy my descendants after me, not to blot out my name from my father's house." So David swore to Saul, and Saul went to his home, and David and his men went up to the fort. The end of chapters 19 through 24 of the first book of Samuel. Recording by Mark Penfold. The first book of Samuel, chapters 25 through 31. Chapter 25. At this time Samuel died, and the parliament of Israel collected and mourned for him and buried him at his home in Ramah. Thereupon David arose and went down to the desert of Paran. There was a man in Maon whose property lay in Carmel, and the man was very great, for he possessed 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats. He was at this time shearing his sheep in Carmel. This man's name was Nabal, and his wife was named Abigail. She was a very clever woman and beautiful in appearance, but her husband was brutish and excessively bad, like one of his dogs. David heard in the desert that Nabal was shearing his sheep, so David sent some of his lads, and David said to the lads, "March to Carmel and go to Nabal and wish him well in my name. You must also say this, 'Good health to you. How are you? And how are your family? And how is all that you have? I have heard that you are shearing. Although your shepherds are near us, I have not hurt them, nor has anything been missing from them all the time they have been in Carmel. Ask your lads, and they will tell you so. So let these youths find favor in your sight, for they come at a good time. Therefore give what comes to your hand to your servants and to your son David." David's lads accordingly went, and reported to Nabal all this speech in the name of David, and sat down. But Nabal answered David's servants, "Who is David? And what is the son of Jessai? Nowadays plenty of slaves run away from their masters. And why should I take my bread and my drink and my roast meat that I have roasted for my shearers, and give to fellows who come from I don't know where?" David's lads consequently went their way, and returned to and came and reported to him all these things. Consequently David said to his men, "Gird on your swords!" And they all girt their swords. David also girt on his sword, and there went up after David about 400 men, while 200 guarded the baggage. One of the lads from among Nabal's servants, however, informed Abigail his wife, saying, "David has sent messengers from the desert to congratulate our master, and he has abused them. Now these men have been very good to us, and have not hurt us, nor stolen anything all the time we wandered about near them in the open field. They were a guard to us by night and by day, all the time we were near them, shepherding the sheep. And now I know and see what troubles me. For there will be plenty of evil for our master and for all his household, because he is such a brute, one cannot speak to him." At this Abigail hastened, and took 200 loaves, and 2 skins of wine, and 5 cooked sheep, and 5 quarters of corn, and 100 packets of raisins, and 200 cakes of figs, and loaded them upon asses, and said to the lad, "Go on before me, I will follow after you." But she did not inform her husband Nabal. Now she rode on her ass, and went down to the foot of the hills, and saw David and his men advancing on her. So she approached them. And David said, "I never broke the bargain. I protected all that belonged to this fellow in the desert, and nothing was missing belonging to him, but he has returned me bad for good. May God do this to the enemies of David, and add to this, if I leave anything belonging to him at morning light, even an urchin behind the wall." Then Abigail was afraid of David. Therefore she hastened and dismounted from her ass, and fell down on her face because of the anger of David, and bowed to him to the earth. Then she knelt at his feet and said, "Let the fault be to me, my lord, and let your handmaid speak in your hearing, and listen to the words of your handmaid. Let not my lord lay to his heart about that blackguard Nabal, for he is like his name, a fool, and folly is with him. But I, your handmaid, saw not the lads of my lord whom you sent. So now, my lord, by the life of the ever-living, by the life of your soul, oh, that the ever-living would restrain you from going to bloodshed, and save you from your own hand. But may your enemies be like Nabal, and whoever seeks to injure my lord. And this present here, which your servant has brought to my lord, give it to the lads who march after the footsteps of my lord. Overlook, therefore, the fault of your handmaid, for the ever-living will make for my lord a safe home. For you fight the battles of the ever-living, my prince, and harm will not meet you all your time. When a man rises to pursue you to seek your life, then the life of my lord will be treasured in the treasury of your ever-living God, while the life of your enemies will be slung from the hand of the slinger. It will be so, for the ever-living will effect for my prince all the good he has promised to you, and will appoint you to be a leader to Israel. So let not this be an agitation and disturbance to the heart of my prince, to cause him to shed needless blood. Let my prince save himself from himself, and the ever-living will reward my prince, when you will remember your handmaid." Then David replied to Abigail, "Thank the Lord of Israel, who has sent you today to meet me, and bless your skill. And bless you who have prevented me today from bloodshed, and saving my hand from myself. For certainly by the life of the ever-living, the God of Israel, who restrained me from injuring you, if you had not been quick and come to meet me, there would not have been left to Nabal an urchin behind his wall this morning." David then accepted what she had brought to him, and said to her, "Go in peace to your home. You see I have listened to your voice, and gladdened your face." Abigail therefore went to Nabal, but he was drinking in his house as at a royal feast, and the heart of Nabal was pleased with himself, and he was very drunk. So she told him nothing, great or small, until morning light. But in the morning, when the wine had gone out of Nabal, his wife informed him of these events, when his heart died in his breast, and he became like a stone. And 10 days after, the ever-living struck Nabal, and he died. When David heard that Nabal was dead, he exclaimed, "Thank the ever-living who has avenged my insult on the head of Nabal, and restrained his servant from wrong, for the ever-living has returned the insults of Nabal upon his own head." David also sent and spoke to Abigail to take her as a wife. So David's officers went to Abigail at Carmel and said to her, "David has sent us to you to take you to himself as a wife." Then she arose and bowed her face earthward and said, "I am your servant to attend to wash the feet of the servants of my lord." Then Abigail prepared in haste and mounted her ass, and 5 of her maids went with her on foot and marched after the messengers of David. Thus she became his wife. David also took Ahinoam of Jezreel, and they were both his wives. Saul, however, gave Michal his daughter, the wife of David, to Phalti ben Laish, who was from Galim. Chapter 26. The Ziphites then went to Saul at Gibeah, and said, "Do you know that David is in hiding in the hills of Keilah opposite Jeshimon?" Saul consequently arose and went down to the desert of Ziph with 3,000 men, the choicest of Israel, to hunt after David in the desert of Ziph, and Saul encamped in the hills of Keilah opposite Jeshimon by the roadside. But David occupied the desert, and saw when Saul came after him towards the desert. David also sent spies, and learnt that Saul came resolutely. David therefore arose, and came to the place where Saul was encamped. And David saw the place where Saul and Abner ben Ner, the commander of Saul's army, slept. But Saul slept within a barricade of wagons, with his forces around them. So David addressed Achimelech the Hittite, and Abishai ben Zeruiah, brother of Joab, and said, "Who will go down with me to Saul in the camp?" And Abishai replied, "I will go down with you." Therefore David and Abishai went to the army at night, and saw Saul laid asleep within the barricade of wagons, with his spear stuck in the ground at his head, and Abner and the forces sleeping around them. Then Abishai said, "God has today delivered your enemy into your hand, so now I will pin him at a stroke with a spear to the earth and not waken him." But David answered his officer, "You shall not destroy him, for who can raise his hand against the consecrated to the ever-living and be blameless?" Then David added, "By the life of the ever-living, if the Lord struck him, or his day came and he died, or he went down to battle and was killed, but it would bring trouble on me from the ever-living if I raised my hand against the Lord's consecrated. However, take the spear that is by his head and the jug of water, and let us be gone." So David took the spear and the jug of water from beside the head of Saul, and went away with them. And none saw, and none knew, and none awoke, for they all slept. A deep sleep had fallen on them from the ever-living. David then passed over the ford, and stood at the top of a hill at a distance, with a great space between them, from where David called to the forces and to Abner ben Ner, asking, "Are you there, Abner?" When Abner rejoined and said, "Who are you, calling to the commander?" So David replied to Abner, "Are you not a man? And who is like you in Israel? So why have you not guarded your master the commander? For a person has been to destroy the commander, your lord. By the life of the ever-living, it is not a good thing that you have done, for you are liable to death for not guarding your master, who is consecrated to the ever-living. So now look for your commander's spear and water jug which were by his head." But Saul recognized the voice of David, and asked, "Is that your voice, son David?" And David replied, "It is my voice, my lord commander." And then he continued, "Why does my lord hunt so after his servant? For what have I done? And what wrong is there in my hand? Let my lord the king listen therefore to what your servant says. If the ever-living has excited you, let me be a sweet perfumed offering. But if any of mankind, curse them before the ever-living for driving me out from the inheritance of the ever-living to herd with vagabonds, saying, 'Go, go serve other gods.' But now let not my blood fall to the earth away from the presence of the ever-living. For what has the commander of Israel come out to hunt? A single flea, as they hunt a partridge on the mountains?" Then Saul answered, "I have done wrong. Come back, my son David, for I will never injure you, since my life has been respected in your sight today. I have acted like a fool, and 10,000 times mad." David replied and said, "Here is the commander's spear. Let one of the lads come over and take it, for the ever-living rewards a man for his honesty and fidelity. Now as the ever-living gave you today to my power, and I refrained from lifting my hand against the consecrated to the ever-living, therefore as your life was respected today in my eyes, Let thus my life be respected in the eyes of the ever-living, for he will deliver me from every trouble." Then Saul said to David,
"Son David, you are noble. What you wish you will accomplish by the self-command you have exercised."
David then went his way, and Saul returned to his residence. Chapter 27. David, however, said in his heart, "I shall fall some day into the hand of Saul. Would it not be well for me to take refuge in the country of the Philistine? When Saul will give up hunting after me again in any of the districts of Israel, and I shall protect myself from his hand." David consequently passed over, he and the 600 men with him, to Achish ben Maoch, king of Gath, where David and his men settled in Gath with Achish, each with his family, and David with his 2 wives, Achinoam the Jezreelitist, and Abigail the widow of Nabal the Carmelitess. And it was reported to Saul that David had fled to Gath, so Saul did not again hunt for him. David afterwards said to Achish, "If now I have found favor in your sight, give me a residence in one of your country villages, and I will stay there. For why should your servant live in the royal city with you?" Achish consequently assigned to him at once Ziklag. Therefore Ziklag belongs to the kings of Judah to this day. And the length of time that David stayed in the country of the Philistine was 1 year and 4 months. But David and his men went and plundered the Geshurites, and the Girzites, and the Amalekites, who were in the country which lies towards the wall of the land of Mitzer. So David conquered the country, leaving neither men nor women alive, but taking the sheep, and cattle, and asses, and camels, and clothing, then returned and came to Achish. And Achish asked, "Where have you been plundering this time?" David answered, "Towards the south of Judah, and towards the south of the Irachmalites, and to the south of the Kenites." For David did not let a man or a woman go with him to Gath, remarking, "For fear they should tell of us, and say, 'David has done this.'" He, however, plundered in this way all the time he stayed in the country of the Philistine. And Achish believed David, reflecting, "He will make himself stink with his nation, the Israelites, and then he will be my subject forever." Chapter 28. It was at this time the Philistine assembled their forces for war with Israel, and Achish said, "I know that you will go with me to the campaign with your men." And David answered, "You know well enough what your servant will do." And Achish replied to David, "Certainly. Therefore I will appoint you as captain of my guard all the time." When Samuel died, and all Israel had mourned for him, they buried him near Ramah in his own village, and Saul drove away the spirit-raisers and the soothsayers from the country. But the Philistine collected and advanced, and encamped at Shunem. Saul also assembled the forces of Israel, and encamped at Gilboa. When Saul saw the camp of the Philistine, he feared, and his heart trembled extremely. Saul consequently inquired of the ever-living, but the ever-living did not answer him, neither by dreams, nor by visions, nor by prophets. Consequently Saul said to his officers, "Seek me a woman who possesses a divining spirit, and I will go and inquire of her." And his officers replied to him, "There is a woman at Endor who possesses a spirit." Then Saul stripped and clothed himself in different colors, and went, he and 2 officers with him, and came to the woman at night, and said to her, "Will you call to a spirit for me now, and bring to me whoever I tell you?" But the woman replied to him, "What? When you know what Saul has done, who has driven the spirit-raisers and the scientists from the country? So why do you seek for my life to get me killed?" Then Saul swore to her by the ever-living, saying, "By the ever-living life, nothing hurtful shall happen to you for the affair." So the woman asked him, "Whom shall I bring up to you?" And he replied, "Bring up Samuel to me." And when the woman saw Samuel, she shrieked with a loud voice, and said to Saul, "Why have you deceived me? You are Saul." But the king answered her, "Fear not for me. Who? What have you seen?" And the woman said to Saul, "I saw divine messengers ascending out of the earth." He then asked her, "What is he like?" She replied, "An old man is now coming up, and he is covered with a cloak." And Saul recognized that it was Samuel, and fell face forward to the ground, and was terrified. Then Samuel said to Saul, "For what have you disturbed me to bring me up?" And Saul replied,
"I am in great distress, for the Philistine are at war with me, and God has turned from me, and answers me no more, neither by means of instructors, nor by dreams. So I called to you to tell me what to do."
Samuel then asked, "And for what do you inquire of me, when God has turned away and is far from you? The ever-living will do to you as he said through me. For the ever-living has taken the commandership from your hand, and will give it to your neighbor, to David, because you did not listen to the voice of the ever-living, and did not execute his deep wrath upon the Amalekites. Therefore the ever-living has brought this trouble to you today. The ever-living also will give Israel with you into the hands of the Philistine, and tomorrow you shall be with me. The ever-living will also give the camp of Israel into the hand of the Philistine." Saul then immediately fell down to the earth, for he could not stand, and was greatly terrified at the words of Samuel. Beside, there was no strength in him, for he had not eaten food all that day and all that night. But the woman came to Saul in great terror and agitation, and said to him, "You see, your servant has listened to your voice, and I have placed my life in my hand, and have listened to the request you made me. Therefore listen now yourself to the voice of your servant, and I will put before you a mouthful of food, so eat it, and it will strengthen you, that you can go on your way." But he refused, and said,
"I will not eat."
His attendants, however, urged him, and the woman also. He therefore listened to their voices, and arose from the ground, and rested upon a couch. And the woman, having a fat calf in the stable, hastened and killed it, and took flour and kneaded and baked biscuits, and approached Saul and his attendants, and they ate, and arose and went away in the night. Chapter 29. The Philistine had now assembled all their forces at Aphek, and Israel had encamped at the well which is in Jezreel. And the forces of the Philistine advanced by battalions and regiments, but David and his men were with Achish in the rear. The generals of the Philistine, however, asked, "Who are these Hebrews?" And Achish answered the generals of the Philistine, "Is not this David, the officer of Saul, king of Israel, who has been with me for this year or two, and I have not found in him any fault from the day he deserted until now?" The generals of the Philistine, however, collected about him, and the generals of the Philistine said to him, "Send the man away, and let him go to his residence, where let him be retained. For he shall not advance with us to the campaign, lest he betray us in the campaign. For how could he reconcile himself to his prince? Would it not be by the heads of our men? Is not this David, about whom they chorused with dances, saying, 'Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s?'" Achish consequently summoned David and said to him, "By the ever-living life, in my opinion you have been right and good in your intercourse with me in the camp. Nor have I found anything wrong about you from the day you came up to me until this time. But the opinion of the nobles is not good about you. Therefore return, and go away quietly, and create no offense in the sight of the Philistine lords." David, however, asked Achish, "Why? What have I done? What have you found in your servant from the day I came to you until this day, that I may not go and fight the enemies of my lord the king?" But Achish answered and said to David, "I acknowledge you are as good in my opinion as a messenger of God. The generals of the Philistine, however, say, 'He shall not advance with us to the campaign.' So now rest till the morning with the servants of your prince who came with you, but arise at dawn of light with them, and depart." Consequently David and his men rested until they marched at dawn to return to the country of the Philistine. Then the Philistine advanced to Jezreel. Chapter 30. But when David and his men arrived at Ziklag on the third day, they found that the Amalekites had devastated the south up to Ziklag, and attacked Ziklag, and burnt it with fire, and captured the women who were in it, from the least to the greatest. They did not kill a single person, but carried them off and departed. So when David and his men came to the town, they saw it burnt by fire, and their wives, children, and daughters carried off. Then David and the people who were with him lifted up their voices and wept until there was no more strength in them to weep. The 2 wives of David also were captured, Ahinoam the Jezreelitess, and Abigail the widow of Nabal the Carmelite. And it troubled David greatly, for the people threatened to stone him. For the soul of all the forces was bitter because of their sons and daughters, but David relied upon his ever-living God. David consequently said to Abiathar the priest, son of Achimelech, "Bring me the ephod." And Abiathar brought the ephod to David, and David inquired of the ever-living, asking, "Shall I pursue this troop, and can I overtake them?" When he replied to him, "Follow, for you shall overtake and deliver." Therefore David and the 600 men with him marched and came to the canal at the wall, where part halted. But David and 400 men continued the pursuit, whilst 200 men, who were exhausted, halted at the passage of the canal of the wall. And they found a man, an Egyptian, in the field, and took him to David. They gave him food, and he ate, and they quenched him with water. They also gave him a slice of fig cake and 2 bunches of raisins, and he ate, and his energy returned to him, for he had not eaten food nor drank water for 3 days and 3 nights. David then asked him, "Who are you, or from where?" And he answered, "I am a young Egyptian, the slave of an Amalekite, and my master abandoned me 3 days ago because I broke down. We had devastated the pastures of the Kithites as high up as Judah, and the pastures of Caleb, and we burnt Ziklag with fire." David next asked him, "Will you guide me to this gang?" And he replied, "Swear to me by God that you will not kill me, and not give me up to the hand of my master, and I will lead you to that gang." So he led them, and they were scattered all over the ground, eating and drinking, and feasting upon the great booty they had taken from the country of the Philistine, and from the land of Judah. David therefore assailed them with spirit from the evening to the next day, and none of them escaped except 400 young men who mounted on camels and fled. Then David rescued all the Amalekites had taken, and David also rescued his 2 wives, and they lost no one, small or great, of their sons or daughters. And the plunder and all that they had taken with them David got back. But David took all the sheep and cattle they drove out from that camp to himself, and said, "This is David's booty." But when David approached the 200 men who had been exhausted by the march after David, and who stayed by the canal of the wall, they came out to meet David and the force with him, and David came to them and wished them health. But all the vile and blackguardly fellows among those who marched with David objected, and said, "Because they did not go with us, none of the booty that we have captured shall be given to them, except to each one his wife and children. Let them take them and be off." David, however, said, "You shall not do so, brothers, since the ever-living has given it to us, and has guarded us, and delivered the gang who fell upon us into our power. And who will listen to this talk of yours? As for the share of the man who goes into battle, and the share of him who stays with the baggage, both shall be equal." So from that day forwards it was fixed as an institution and decree for Israel until this time. When David arrived at Ziklag, he sent part of the booty to the princes of Judah, his neighbors, saying, "Here is a present to you from the plunder of the enemies of the ever-living." To those also in Bethel, and those in Ramah Negeb, and those in Jathir, and those in Ashima, and those in Rakal, and those in the villages of the Arakmalai, and to those in the villages of the Kenites, and those in Carmah, and those in Korashan, and to those in Athak, and to those in Kebron, and to all the places where men had been with his men. Chapter 31. But the Philistine fought with Israel, and the men of Israel fled before the Philistine, and fell routed on the mountains of Gilboa. Thus the Philistine defeated Saul and his sons, and the Philistine killed Jonathan, and Abinadab, and Melchishua, the sons of Saul. Then the battle rested upon Saul, but the archers advanced upon him with their bows, and he was grievously wounded by the archers. Saul consequently said to his squire,
"Draw your sword and stab me with it, for fear these foul fellows should come and stab me and outrage over me."
But his squire refused, for he was in great terror. So Saul took the sword and fell upon it. And when his squire saw that Saul was dead, then he also fell upon his sword and died with him. Thus Saul died with his 3 sons and his squire and all his guards in one day. But when the Israelites who were beyond the valley and beyond the Jordan saw that the army of Israel was routed, and that Saul and his sons were dead, they abandoned the villages and fled, and the Philistine came and occupied them. When it was morning, the Philistine came to strip the slain, and found Saul and his 3 sons fallen on the mountains of Gilboa. So they cut off his head, and stripped off his armor, and sent around the country of the Philistine to proclaim the good news in the temples of their idols and to the people. Then they placed his arms in the temples of Ashtaroth, and hung up his body upon the walls of Beth-shan. But the inhabitants of Jabesh-gilead heard about it, and what the Philistine had done to Saul. Consequently all the brave men arose, and marched all night, and took the body of Saul and the bodies of his sons from the walls of Beth-shan, and brought them to Jabesh, and burnt them there. They afterward took the bones, and buried them under the tamarind tree in Jabesh, and mourned 7 days. The end of chapters 25 through 31, and the end of the first book of Samuel, from the Holy Bible in Modern English, translated by Farrar Fenton. Recording by Mark Penfold.